Hi, everybody. I'm Neka Etaniru, Avenue Z's EVP of Global Brand Strategy and an in-house PR and public affairs expert. I'm joined today by Dr. Jumo Ayandele. And Jumo, thank you for being here with us today. Great to have you.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you again for having me on your platform. My name is Dr. Jumo Ayandele. I am a visiting assistant professor at the Center for Global Affairs at New York University. And I'm very excited about the conversation that we're about to have today. It's very, very telling given that, you know, some people might say the world is in disarray.
Yeah, seriously. Actually, public affairs is needed more than ever. But before we get into that, you mentioned obviously NYU, Go Violets, our alma mater.
Mhm.
What a lot of folks obviously wouldn't know is that Jumo and I actually we went to NYU together. Jumo, it's been, what year are we? 2024. So it's I think 17 years since we've met, since we started originally at NYU, which is kind of wild to think about.
Yes, definitely. It's full circle moment from being an undergrad to now being a professor and impacting, as I tell my students, the next generation of world leaders. And I'm hoping that I'm doing a good job, but you never know.
And I mean, your class, you've come to Avenue Z's offices. I know you chat through a variety of global issues with your course. So, what are some of the things that you all touch on and talk about? So, for our listeners as well, they can be more aware of what it is that you specialize in.
For sure. So my specialization is more transnational security. I look at the global south, in particular Africa. So my classes are centered on my research interests. So for instance, this semester I'm teaching a class on African politics, security, and economic development. I also teach a class on transnational security where we look at budding and emerging security issues that range from climate change to emerging technology, to space wars. I know we don't think about space wars, but there's a budding space war right now. And the classic traditional IR issues such as interstate wars. So that is really what I do. And I also do a lot of conflict data research, using conflict and data in particular to understand local contexts.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's also very interesting to think about space wars as, of course, broader foreign policy, national security, transnational issues as well.
Mhm.
Very curious to get your thoughts on that at some point. So thank you for sharing that. But before we dive
Mhm.
into today's key topics, let's start with a bit of a reflection on our recent discussion with His Excellency and the Minister, of course, of Nigeria's Foreign Affairs, um, whom you had a really interesting chat with at
Yeah.
NYU a few
Mhm.
weeks back, and talked with him actually about some of these topics, right? Nigeria's place within the broader geopolitical landscape and some of the undertakings that the government is doing to broaden understanding of Nigeria as a whole and to have a greater reach um, for different folks to understand the arts, the politics, etc. of
Mhm.
of
Yeah.
Nigeria. So, what were some of your takeaways from that, and how do you think about the things that Nigeria is doing to
Mhm.
kind of shape its image and perception globally?
Yes, and that's a very good question, by the way. It was a pleasure to have His Excellency Yusuf Tuga at NYU. I would say it was one of the first times where we hosted an African politician, somebody, that it was a senior or is a senior government official at the Center for Global Affairs. And I think it's very, very telling because His Excellency is very, very particular about the image that he wants to project about the country. And I think this is very important because it centers Africa as an agent, not a subject in international relations, with changing the narrative of what is important to us, right? So with the minister, for example, especially with the global context and how he sees Nigeria positioning itself, he had mentioned his 4Ds. The first one being democracy, the second one being demographics, right? Because Nigeria and the African continent is going to have one of the largest populations in the next couple of decades, right? So demographics, diaspora, which is very important, right? We have a huge diaspora all over the world. And then last but not the least, development, and how all these four Ds shape the foreign policy of Nigeria and centers Africa, right, in Nigeria's foreign policy, in really projecting and in building the Africa that we want. So it was a fantastic conversation that I had with his foreign minister. And I'm hoping to have more of such conversations where we bring African senior officials to really tell us what is going on, what governments themselves want, not what we think they want from the West.
For sure. I mean, it's so interesting, especially all of the 4Ds, but especially the aspects I think of diaspora. As a member of the Nigerian diaspora, you also have come obviously to now live and work in New York, and obviously you go back home a lot, etc. But it's really interesting to think about the Nigerian diaspora and the way that the population is growing,
Yes.
and the fact that like so many different folks in different places obviously have different needs and priorities, and so these government initiatives and the agenda has to be able to reach all of the distinct members of the diaspora with messages that matter to them, and to
Yes.
understand as different members of the diaspora that everybody has unique viewpoints, different opinions, different
Mhm.
things that are important to them. And so how do you think about targeting and reaching each of these different unique members of the diaspora with messages that will resonate, and how does that element of things come into play from a policy and agenda perspective, and when
Mhm.
it comes to shaping reputation and perception issues for the government of Nigeria? That to me is something that's really interesting.
Yes. I think the very first part is acknowledging that you have a huge diaspora and that is a resource, right? Because you can have a diaspora and you don't think it's a resource to be tapped in. So I do think that's the first step. And the Nigerian government has, and the foreign minister has done a very good job recognizing the power of diaspora and what we also bring when it comes to reshaping the image of Nigeria as a whole. I mean, not to mince words, most people think about Nigeria and think about the prince and the scam and the scams, right? And how do we change that? And I remember the foreign minister, and also with conversations that I've had with other fellow Africans, being that Nigeria's greatest exports, apart from its people, are also its culture, right? Afrobeats today is so huge. That's one of Nigeria's soft power, right?
Yeah,
When it comes to fashion, we're known as Lagos is known as the fashion capital of Africa, right? That is how
yeah,
you're able to tap into diaspora, how you're able to shape and change narratives. And I would
yeah,
say in the United States, it also helps that a lot of Nigerian diasporas or immigrants that are in the United States are one of the most highly educated people, right? And are making so much strides in their various sectors. So all of these intersect, all of this are what the government, I am hoping, is using to reshape so that people want to reinvest back at home, which is the next step.
yeah, absolutely. And I think also, by the way, it's Lagos Fashion Week right now too, right? Speaking of fashion, it's Lagos Fashion Week. So I love seeing that come and even upgrade their presence in the global stage. I think, we see so many, if you're following influencers or whomever online, it's been really interesting actually to see an increasing number of the influencers actually going to Lagos Fashion Week right now and posting about
Yes.
following, highlighting Nigerian designers and different people beyond just the normal, typical fashion weeks you see influencers at.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely is that shift and really that perception shaping happening from the cultural element that Nigeria brings to the table as well. And I mean, you mentioned Afrobeats, and one of the things in the conversation with the minister that came up was, of course, as well, like Nollywood and
Yes, Nollywood. Yes.
exporting media, exporting culture, and that really being a way as well to create influence and to
Yeah.
shape people's perception.
Definitely.
Um,
Definitely.
and so, I mean, it's been really interesting as well to see, like, even places like Netflix, right? Huge
Mhm.
platforms that are creating a bigger platform for Nollywood and
Yeah.
for a variety of the types of stories to be told that
Mhm.
wouldn't have had nearly the potential audience to
Yeah.
see them, and to watch them, and
Yeah.
to hear them, and then obviously learn so much and create better bridges and connections between people, and creating those meaningful connections obviously ultimately will drive even further opportunities for changes.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. All good points.
So, shifting for a moment to affairs, of course, we are seeing heightened geopolitical tensions and escalations across the globe, but in particular, of course, war in the Middle East,
Mhm.
and globally. And
Yes.
we're also a week out from US elections.
Yeah.
And as we think about the broader impact of US relations, global relations, particularly in the global south, I would love to hear like what might this confluence of events signal for international alliances, especially
Yeah.
from the standpoint of trust building globally,
Mhm.
and how we think about reinforcing credibility, and these situations that we're navigating right now.
Yeah. That's a very good question, and I must say a very tough one because it's like two or three questions in one.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try to tackle to the best of my ability. And this is me putting my, academic hat and my policy practitioner hat on.
Yeah.
And I will first start off with, the conflict that we're seeing right now in the Middle East, and obviously with, Russia and Ukraine, and what this means for the African continent. For most senior officials that I have spoken to, um, how the West has treated these conflicts in comparison to the conflicts that happen in Africa has been very telling about the importance of the continent to them, right? The willingness to support, for instance, Ukraine with training, with military assistance, right? With that support, they haven't necessarily seen that same support with the many conflicts that they feel is on the same level with what is happening, whether it is in Europe or what is happening with the Middle East. And for a lot of these senior policy officials, a lot of security analysts that are from the continent, it just means that African governments now know that they have to have more diverse options when it comes to who they want to ally themselves with. And most African countries will tell you that they are part of the non-allied movement, where they are not laid into whether it's the West or whether it is, Russia or whether it is China. But I would say that African governments know that they have options now, and they're not necessarily leading to the West anymore. So you would see that most African governments today are doing more business with China, for example, versus the US. And some people might say, and I have heard from the West, that this is another form of neo-colonialism with, China coming into Africa, but it just looks a very, very different way. But when you ask senior officials about this relationship with China, they see it more as partnership, as a business opportunity because China is coming into the continent to actually invest in infrastructure versus what we have seen from the West, which is more, humanitarian aid. We haven't necessarily seen a Marshall Plan. And with the Belt and Road Initiative with China, some people are touting it as China's Africa's Marshall Plan, where it is actually invested in making Africa developed. And for a lot of African governments, they are seeing an alternative to you don't have to have democracy for you to have economic development. China had development without necessarily being fully democratic, right? So again, as I said, more options, and that is because of for these African officials, from their own perspective, it's the hypocrisy of how the West has tackled these events in the Middle East, these events in Europe with Ukraine and with Russia, and it's a situation of them not feeling that Africa is at the forefront of the U.S. foreign policy or the EU's foreign policy, and them knowing that they just have to take care of themselves.
Thank you for that. It's definitely, we could go on and on and on digging into that for sure. But I appreciate you sharing that perspective. because it's also really interesting to think of that angle and that lens and the things that you've heard from other African leaders. Because on the one hand, you know, in so many ways, the global South, it does face really a messaging and perception issue
Yeah.
where there's this thought that, like, oh, okay, in many ways, maybe you're behind the times, etc. But realistically, some of the global South and several African nations in particular are some of the leaders when it comes to things like developing and using emerging technologies,
Mm-hmm.
leveraging different types of, for example, payments technologies. Um,
Yes.
some of the literal leaders when it comes to these neo-banking
Yeah.
opportunities and solutions,
Yeah.
Kenya, Nigeria, and beyond, are actually some of the global leaders when it comes to these things in industries and sectors.
Yeah.
So having the conversation and thinking about what does it mean to be from the global South, and especially as you think about allying oneself and receiving humanitarian aid or partnering with certain different types of countries and governments, so much of it comes back to perception
Yeah.
and the message that is being put out there about a place, a global South, the different countries in particular, and the industries and opportunities for innovation within those countries, individually and collectively.
Yes.
And
And if
then,
I want to jump in, I would say it's and you mentioned a very good point about neobanks and the banking system. And all these indigenous mechanisms, it's interesting because when the global South or African countries are at the forefront, the West discounts it, right? It doesn't see it as innovation per se, right?
mhm.
And I remember, for instance, Zelle, when did Zelle just come out? Maybe like 3, 4, 5 years ago. But we've been able to do instant bank transfers since God knows, since the beginning of time. Not the beginning of time, but for a
But
very long
longer
time.
than Zell, much longer than Zell for a while. Okay.
When Zelle was the
Yeah, even like when we were in December, last December, you all had so many more. When I was there, and you guys were like, "Oh, you had like 10 different apps to be able to do things way more effectively and efficiently." And I was over there trying to like Zell you, and you're like, "Girl, no, like let's do this." I was like, "Okay."
the point I want to make is it comes a time where it is okay to say that the global south is innovative in particular sectors and for the West to also embrace it and acknowledge it, especially if it wants to have that sphere of influence in the African continent or in the global south. It cannot discount the innovations that countries such as Rwanda or Kenya or Nigeria or South Africa or Egypt are making or the strides that they are making and saying, well, this is not exactly what we think development is, or this is not exactly what we think cooperation should look like. You should also understand, or you should also be willing to see from the other perspective the strides that they are making. And I think that's the disconnect, especially when it comes to influence, with expectations of what should versus what ought to be.
Well said. I mean, 100%. I'm there with you. I think it's also, it goes back to the idea of how do you drive influence and doing it in a way that you can combat the misperceptions and misinformation that's out there and restore a sense of credibility and let people know, hey, actually, here's all the stuff that's actually going on out here. So I think there definitely needs to be some very concerted approaches by both the individual sort of governments, public sector efforts, as well as by private sectors, the companies that want to work with, drive innovation, figuring out ways that they can develop partnerships and get involved. And there needs to be really concerted, thoughtful approaches and campaigns to educate and raise broader awareness and also combat a lot of the disinformation and misinformation that
Oh,
is
for
out
sure. Yes, that's a big one right now on the continent. Yeah.
there. And I think there's also a lot of opportunity to like leverage obviously um, social media, etc., to figure out ways of bolstering our stories up. And a big part of that comes back to knowing how to navigate the algorithms online, and with just the way that information is being gained today is so different, and the way that people are connecting and learning about each other's stories are so different. And so
Yeah.
it becomes more important than ever for us to understand how to use those things to our advantage, especially as we want to amplify stories in the global south, companies that are doing the work,
Yeah,
and broader initiatives that are happening globally.
for sure.
Uh, but I want to switch gears for a second and talk a little bit about broader communications for higher ed. And obviously, again, given the context of the upcoming elections,
Yeah.
obviously, you work at NYU, you are an academic at heart. You have, been working with a core group of students every semester. I've met some of them. They're
Mhm.
wonderful young minds. With the election just away,
Mhm.
obviously, I think that campuses are feeling additional pressures to manage diverse viewpoints and heightened emotions.
Yeah.
So, as a practitioner and an academic yourself, like, what would you recommend universities do and think about to navigate these dynamics and to engage their communities, effectively?
Mm. Hmm. Wow, that's a good one. I can only speak to what NYU does for us, and I'm hoping that this can be a takeaway for other universities. I would say definitely, definitely, offer guidance to faculty members on how to maintain inclusivity. I do know that, at the beginning of the semester, there were some training programs for us faculty on how to do this, how to bring in diverse voices, especially in the context of, the upcoming elections in a week, and also what has been happening with the conflicts that we see in the Middle East and with the Russia-Ukraine crisis. So that's definitely one. Offering your professors, your faculty, that guidance on how to maintain inclusivity. So that's one. The second one has to do with ensuring campus safety. Everybody wants to feel safe. Nobody wants to feel that their voices are not necessarily being heard, and that can be used to hurt them. So ensuring campus safety is number two. I would also say the third one and the most important one being addressing the concerns of various stakeholders. So various stakeholders being, students regardless of their political leanings, right? Faculty members themselves, right? I'll also say parties. I remember when we were in college, for instance, and I think this was 2008 when Barack was about to get elected, we had all of these put in place by NYU with campus security, with addressing the concerns of various stakeholders, saying that this was going to be the first black president in the United States, and also trying to maintain that inclusivity and diversity that makes NYU very, very unique. And I'm hoping
Yeah.
that other universities can also gain and get some viewpoints out of this.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember as well, you mentioned 2008 and Obama. I mean, I remember when you put us on buses and we
Yeah,
went to the
Times Square.
celebration there, all there in Times Square. And it's so wild that that was
Yeah,
16 years ago.
15 years
Uh,
ago.
I literally remember that like it was yesterday. But of course, I mean, they had so many things put up in place in terms of safety and just managing the situation. I think for universities and for these types of education
Yeah,
organizations, it's
yeah,
really important to have that proactive plan in place and to just communicate about things leading up to any major, events, etc. Using social media, official statements, etc. Really think about how the institution can help to guide community dialogue and
yeah.
really reduce potential tension in advance. And
Yes, for
yeah,
sure.
go on.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I'm just thinking about all the voting drives that NYU has had. So I know when we were in school, we're using Blackboard, but now we use Brightspace. And anytime you log in, you just see NYU votes, and it takes you to a link if you haven't been able to register. It's literally in your face. If you are a U.S. citizen and you can vote, NYU is in your face with emails, with how to be safe, right? With your voice matters, right? And I think that's what NYU is doing very, very well, using different channels to drive that registration, to drive people to actually want to vote. And even as faculty members, we've been told to be a little bit lax on election day if we do have classes because students have to vote.
I love that. I mean, I'm somebody that's like of the persuasion that we should try to make election day and
A
a
public
holiday.
holiday? Yes, yes. We're on the same page. It should be a public holiday.
There shouldn't be any sort of hindrance to that.
Yeah,
I would love a world where we were all able to get that done, and everybody who wants to can accomplish it easily
exactly.
with the skills that
Yeah.
they need.
Hmm.
Um, but listen, I know we are at time, but I thank you so much
Of
for
course. This was a
us. No, it was so fun. Thank you for having this time with us. And let us know. So, where can people find you? Where can they follow you? Where can they read your stuff?
yeah.
Find out what your thoughts and opinions are on things. What's the
You can find me on my website. You can probably my name is on the screen or in the description, so you
yes?
can check out my website. I'm on X, formerly known as Twitter. I'm still trying to like get used to the X versus Twitter situation.
Mhm.
And my handle is at Jumo_Ayandele, AYANDELE. I'm also on LinkedIn, but the best way to contact me is via my website. I have a contact page there. Always willing to hear from you all. So do send me a hello. I enjoyed this podcast, and I look forward to receiving your emails.
Excellent. What's the name of your website for those who are just listening in
Yes,
only?
definitely. It is my full name: OLAJUMOKEAYANDELE.com.
Excellent. Well, with that, we thank you, Jubo, and we look forward to speaking again soon. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks.